Once, something that was not human walked the earth. Massive, powerful, something the Bible mentions in only 4 verses before rushing to bury it and never speaking of it again. The story I'm about to tell you today is so unsettling that for centuries, even clergy have lowered their voices when reading these verses, and some preachers have skipped these pages entirely. So what really happened? Who were the sons of God? Why did these beings called the Nephilim corrupt the world so badly that God had to wipe out everything he had created and start over? And here's the question that confuses people the most. Why does the Bible still mention traces of these beings even after the flood? How is it that centuries later, on a different continent, on a different battlefield, the very same word appears again? In this video, we're going to step into one of the most mysterious, least discussed passages in Genesis. At some points I won't be able to give you a definitive answer, because theologians haven't been able to for thousands of years. But stay until the end, because at the end of this story is a truth that matters to your life even today. Even someone who has read the Bible for years usually skips right past the first 4 verses of Genesis 6. But these 4 verses actually hold the key to everything that follows the flood, the choosing of Noah, and perhaps even the giants in the land of Canaan. Here, we don't run from the hard verses, we step into them. Let's begin. The silent collapse of a generation. After being cast out of the Garden of Eden, humanity multiplied along 2 branches. On one side was the line of Cain, the descendants of a brother killer, men who built cities, forged iron, invented art, but a line that drifted further and further from God. On the other side was the line of Seth, the descendants of the son born in place of the murdered Abel, a line that kept calling on the name of the Lord. Centuries passed. Generation followed generation. Names piling on top of names: Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. The 5th chapter of Genesis gives us this genealogy in an almost monotonous repetition. He was born, he lived, he fathered sons and daughters, he died. But beneath this monotony, a quiet mystery was unfolding. Because the book of Genesis gives us a strange detail. These 2 lines had originally lived in places far apart from each other. But as time passed, this separation began to break down. And right at this moment, one of the most contested sentences in human history appears. Genesis 6:1-2 says, "Human beings began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose." Now let's stop and look at this sentence. Very few sentences in the Bible have generated this much debate. The sons of God in the original Hebrew, B'nai Ha-Elohim, literally meaning sons of God. This phrase appears elsewhere in the Bible too, at the opening of the book of Job. The sons of God are described as heavenly beings who come before the presence of the Lord. So throughout the rest of the Hebrew text, this term generally carries a meaning that is superhuman, angelic. So what exactly does this phrase mean? Over the centuries, 3 different interpretations have emerged, and each has serious defenders. The first. These were devout men from the line of Seth, and by marrying women from the line of Cain, they corrupted their own sacred standards, a theological corruption, the mixing of the holy with the worldly. This interpretation was defended by early church fathers like St. Augustine. The second. These were powerful kings and nobles, arrogant men who declared themselves divine in the ancient Near East. Kings often described themselves as sons of the gods. According to this reading, the text is criticizing an era of tyranny in which powerful men could take by force any woman they wanted. The third and the oldest, most controversial, but also most widespread interpretation in ancient Judaism is that these truly were angelic beings, fallen angels, spiritual powers who took on human bodies and united with human women. As we'll see shortly, this interpretation is described in far greater detail in a lost book. Whichever interpretation you find most convincing, the text makes one thing very clear. This union was a violation of a boundary, a disruption of order. In the opening chapters of Genesis, everything had been created according to its kind. Boundaries were the fundamental architecture of creation. And Genesis 6 is trying to tell us that somewhere that architecture had been broken, and the result was bigger than you could ever imagine. The giants who walked the earth. Genesis 6-4 contains one of the least explained, most question-mark-inducing sentences in the entire Bible. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Nephilim. The Hebrew root of this word comes from the verb naphal, meaning to fall. So Nephilim literally means the fallen ones, or, according to some interpreters, those who fall upon you, beings who descend upon people with a crushing force. In either case, the word carries the same connotation, a collapse, an unnatural form of existence. The ancient Greek translation known as the Septuagint, prepared by Jewish scholars in the 3rd century before Christ. One of the oldest renderings of the Bible translated this word as gigantes. Yes, that is exactly the root of the word giant. Thousands of years ago, the people reading this text had no doubt at all. They called them giants. This isn't a modern misreading, it's the direct choice made by one of the oldest, most authoritative translations of the text. So what does heroes of old mean? The Hebrew word used is gibborim, mighty warriors, powerful men. Interestingly, this same word will later be used to describe the most elite soldiers in King David's army, David's mighty men. But in Genesis 6, this power doesn't come from natural training or noble birth. It comes from a source that isn't human, a semi-divine lineage. Think about this. In the middle of a society, beings walk around who are far stronger, far taller, far more terrifying than ordinary people. And these beings are called heroes, men of renown. The Hebrew literally means men of the name. These were the celebrities of their age, the legends. But throughout the rest of the Bible, there's always a warning lurking behind this word, because power, when left uncontrolled, always turns into destruction. There's an interesting parallel here. Similar figures appear in other cultures of the ancient Near East, two demigod kings, like those in the Sumerian epics, titans and giants in Greek mythology, heroes born from the union of gods and human women. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the king himself is described as 2/3 god, 1/3 human. Is this similarity a coincidence, or a cultural reflection of a shared real event embedded in humanity's collective memory? This question has occupied archaeologists and theologians for decades. One more linguistic note. The Hebrew root behind men of renown is Anshe Hashem, men of the name. In ancient times, making a name for yourself was the closest thing to immortality. Interestingly, a few chapters later, when people build the Tower of Babel, they use the exact same root. Let us make a name for ourselves. Both are humanity's attempt to reach immortality through its own power, and both end in destruction. What the forbidden book whispers. Now let me tell you about a text that never entered the biblical canon, but that circulated for centuries within Jewish and early Christian tradition, the Book of Enoch. Although never added to the Bible, it was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves of Qumran, meaning at least some Jewish communities took it seriously, copied it, read it. And in the Epistle of Jude, within the New Testament itself, there is a direct quotation from the words of Enoch showing the book was known, even respected, by some early Christians. The Book of Enoch turns those short, mysterious sentences in Genesis 6 into a much more detailed story. According to the text, 200 angels called the Watchers swore an oath on Mount Hermon to descend from heaven because of their desire for human women. Their leader was Semjaza, and these 200 angels sealed themselves to this plan by swearing an oath of loyalty to one another so that none of them could turn back. This was a collective rebellion, not the story of a single fallen being. The story continues. These angels did not just unite with women, they also taught humanity forbidden knowledge. The text describes each angel passing on a different kind of knowledge, the making of weapons and swords, the art of war, the arts of cosmetics and deception, sorcery and divination, the secrets of the stars, astrology. Knowledge was handed over recklessly to a world that wasn't ready for it, and most of it, instead of strengthening humanity, armed it to destroy itself. And as the children who were born the Nephilim grew up, they began to consume humanity with an insatiable hunger, devouring everything humans produced, then turning on animals, and finally on each other and on humans. The earth became too small to satisfy their endless appetite. Now, I need to state this clearly. The Book of Enoch is not canonical. It is not accepted as part of the Bible by either Christian or Jewish tradition. But this text shows us something important. Those brief, compressed sentences in Genesis 6 are actually just a small trace of a much bigger memory from the ancient world. The biblical author chose not to tell this story in full. He only pointed to its outcome. Consider this too. If this transfer of knowledge really happened, it can be read as the first uncontrolled technology transfer in human history. A society, before reaching moral maturity, suddenly gains access to powerful tools. The result isn't progress, it's destruction, because when power arrives before wisdom, it almost always turns into catastrophe. And the result was the complete corruption of the earth. According to the Book of Enoch, the place where these angels descended was not chosen at random. Mount Hermon, with its snow-capped peak near where modern Syria, Lebanon, and Israel meet, was considered sacred in the ancient world. Interestingly, Hermon derives from a Hebrew root meaning oath or curse, because this was where the angels swore their oath. This same mountain reappears later in the Gospels. Some theologians believe it's where Jesus experienced the transfiguration, his face shining like the sun. The same geography became the stage for both darkness and light. So what happened to these fallen angels? The Epistle of Jude in the New Testament makes a direct reference. The angels who did not keep within their own position of authority. He is kept in eternal chains in deepest darkness for the judgment of the great day. The second epistle of Peter uses similar language. These passages show that, even centuries later, the angelic rebellion interpretation behind Genesis 6 was taken seriously within early Christianity, not just a forgotten Jewish legend, but a framework known to first-century Christians as well. The earth filled with violence. Genesis 6-5 describes the point humanity had reached, and this verse is one of the darkest sentences in the entire Bible. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil. Notice the intensity of this sentence. Only, constantly. This isn't a society that occasionally does evil. This is a world where evil has become the default state. This isn't a moral slip. This is a complete systemic collapse. Genesis 6:11 continues. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. The word for violence in Hebrew is Hamas, meaning violence, exploitation, injustice, a world where the strong crush the weak, where no boundary, no mercy remains. So what's the connection to the Nephilim? The text doesn't establish a direct cause and effect relationship, but the sequence is deeply meaningful. First, the violation of the divine human boundary. Then, the birth of the giants. Then, the earth filling with violence. Chaos gave birth to chaos. Once the tearing down of boundaries begins in one area, that destruction seeps into every other area. It's not hard to imagine how a society reaches this point. Once strength is sanctified, the strongest is always assumed to be in the right. The weak stop being someone to protect and become someone to crush. Perhaps this is why the text says it was the earth, not a single individual, that had become completely corrupted. This wasn't an isolated crime. This was a systemic rot. And here comes God's response, one of the most human, most startling sentences in the entire Bible. Genesis 6. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. He regretted it. His heart was troubled. These words seem to run against the image of a limitless, unchanging God. But in truth, they tell us something profound. This is not the cold, distant verdict of an angry judge. This is the grief of a creator watching something he made become this corrupted. The text doesn't show us a ledger, it shows us a broken heart. The one light left in the darkness. At exactly this point, the Bible turns the camera and focuses on a single person. Genesis 6:8-9. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Blameless among the people of his time. Pay attention to this phrase. It isn't speaking of absolute perfection, but of a comparison. Noah was the one uncorrupted man in the middle of a rotten world. Everything around him had been drawn into that corruption, but Noah resisted. Think about this for a moment. Imagine a society in which strength, violence, and unlimited desire have become normalized, even admired. Heroes, celebrities, men of renown represent exactly this corrupted power. And right in the middle of this society, one man remains faithful to the old order, still walking with God. His community probably found him strange, even ridiculous. How lonely a position must that have been? Some Jewish commentators emphasize that Noah's lineage was particularly significant. Genesis 6-9 says Noah's generations were blameless, which, according to some traditions, means his bloodline remained free from the Nephilim mixture. In other words, the purpose of the flood wasn't just moral cleansing, but also a hereditary cleansing, restarting humanity from a single, uncorrupted line. This interpretation is debated, but the text's careful, repetitive language makes it hard to dismiss entirely. One thing is clear. God did not want to destroy all of humanity. He built a specific plan to preserve a single family, a single spark of hope, the first great example of a pattern that will repeat throughout the Bible. Even in the midst of destruction, God always leaves behind a remnant. The 120-year final warning. In Genesis 6-3, God announces a decision, but this decision is not immediate destruction, it's a countdown. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. 120 years. Some interpreters read this as a shortening of individual human lifespan, but a more compelling interpretation is this. This is the time remaining for the world, until the flood, one final chance for repentance. A countdown clock. For 120 years, Noah built the ark, longer than an entire human lifetime. His neighbors watched him, probably mocked him, probably whispered, "That crazy old man," building a giant boat far from any sea. The second epistle of Peter describes Noah as a preacher of righteousness. He didn't just build a boat, he warned the people around him again and again. For 120 years, nobody listened. Think about that. For a span longer than an entire human life, the same warning was given over and over, the same hammering sounds heard every day, the same strange boat growing a little bigger, a little more absurd, with each passing year. And still, only 8 people entered the ark: Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. Out of the entire world, only 8 people. This isn't just an ancient story, it's a striking portrait of patience and stubbornness. God did not rush. He waited 120 years before delivering judgment, warning again and again, giving chance after chance. But patience was not infinite, and one day, that final day came. The Epistle to the Hebrews describes Noah as one warned about things not yet seen, who, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. While the rest of the world waited for visible proof, Noah trusted the unseen, and history showed all of us who turned out to be right. As the waters rose, Genesis chapter 7 describes the flood actually happening, and the details are strikingly specific. All the springs of the great deep burst forth. and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. But the rain alone wasn't what made it so devastating. The phrase, springs of the great deep, tells us that water came bursting up from below as well. From above and from below, at the same time, the world was swallowed by water. Genesis 7:19-20 says, "The waters rose and covered the mountains completely, to a depth of more than 15 cubits, roughly 7 meters. This means even the highest peaks became completely invisible. There was nowhere to run, no mountain to take refuge on. And what happened to those powerful, terrifying Nephilim? The text doesn't tell us explicitly, but the outcome isn't hard to guess. Genesis 7:23. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. No matter how strong, how giant, how heroic they were, the water made everyone equal. There's a profound lesson here. No matter how great human power may be, it is nothing in the face of divine justice. Even the giants drowned. No matter how great, power never guarantees immunity. But what happened afterward? Here's where the story takes a turn that most people don't expect. If the flood wiped out all the Nephilim, why does the Bible speak of giant humans again, long after the flood? In Numbers 13:33, the spies Moses sent into the land of Canaan return with a terrified report. "We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Enoch come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Descendants of the Nephilim, centuries after the flood. So how could this be possible? There are three main explanations. First, this may simply be exaggerated language, meaning extremely terrifying warriors. The spies may have dramatized their fear. Second, the Nephilim line may have survived the flood through someone in Noah's family, perhaps through the line of Ham. Third, the most controversial, if the sons of God truly were fallen angelic beings, this same kind of event may have happened again after the flood, on a more limited scale. Other passages throughout the Bible mention giant peoples as well: the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim. In Deuteronomy 3:11, we're told that Og, king of Bashan, had an iron bed roughly 9 cubits long, about 4 meters, and the text presents this as evidence still visible today. The Bible explicitly identifies Og as the last of the remnant of the Rephaim, a giant lineage that still had a name and a king in Moses' time. Moses' armies fought him at Edrei and defeated him, once again repeating the pattern. With divine help, ordinary people can defeat the greatest heroes. And of course, Goliath, the Philistine warrior, roughly 3 meters tall, armored from head to toe, wielding a massive spear. The giant David killed may well have been the last great, recorded symbol of this ancient line. A young shepherd boy defeating an entire war machine with a sling and a stone isn't just a striking victory story, it's a profound theological statement. Superhuman power will always kneel before divine power. Every explanation here is debated, but the common thread is this: the Bible presents this giant theme not as a one-time, forgotten event, but as a reality that resurfaces again and again in the background of history. Remarkably, Noah's flood is not an isolated Jewish Christian legend either. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of a man named Utnapishtim, warned by a god, who builds a boat, takes animals inside, and sends out birds when the flood ends, written down probably more than 1,000 years before Genesis. The Sumerian legend of Ziusudra tells almost the exact same story. India has the legend of Manu, Greece the legend of Deucalion, and even some indigenous traditions across the Americas contain similar great flood narratives. Skeptics see this as independent cultures, mythologizing similar natural disasters. But another perspective is this: perhaps such a similar story repeating across cultures separated by vast distances is the echo of an event that truly happened, deeply marked into humanity's collective memory. I also need to be honest about something. The more you research this topic, The more fake photos and claims you run into online images claiming archaeologists found a giant human skeleton have circulated for years. Nearly all of these are digitally fabricated, often lifted from photo editing contests and recirculated as if real. No serious archaeological institution has ever confirmed the discovery of an actual giant human skeleton. Genesis 6, Numbers 13, Deuteronomy 3. These are real texts in our oldest manuscripts. But giant skeleton photos are fabricated internet content, keeping the two separate matters for both intellectual honesty and understanding this story's real power. That said, archaeologists have documented skeletons somewhat above average height, around 2.5 meters, occasionally found in ancient cemeteries. Not giant territory, but different enough to have genuinely appeared extraordinary to an ancient observer. Why was this story silenced? Now ask yourself this. Why does this story get so little attention in church sermons, in Sunday school lessons? Why is Noah's Ark always told with cute pairs of animals and a rainbow, while the first 4 verses of Genesis 6 are almost never read, almost never explained? There are a few reasons. First, the text is genuinely ambiguous, and ambiguity tends to breed silence. Second, the story is unsettling. The idea of angelic beings uniting with human women doesn't fit into many traditional theological frameworks. Third, and perhaps most important, this story shows just how quickly, how deeply the world can become corrupted, an uncomfortable reminder that the same pattern could repeat today. But this is exactly why telling this story matters. What Genesis 6 describes is a timeless warning: the crossing of boundaries, being intoxicated by power, the irresponsible use of knowledge, the way heroes and the renowned can actually be the ones carrying destruction. These are the same temptations that appear again and again in every generation, just wearing different costumes. Christ himself draws this exact parallel in Matthew 24:37. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. He continues, for in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and being given in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. The world before the disaster didn't look strange or obviously evil, it looked ordinary. This isn't just a story about the past, it's a pattern that will happen again, one that unfolds unnoticed even today. It's striking that Jesus describes the pre-flood world not as evil, but as normal: eating, drinking, getting married. The truly terrifying part of the disaster is that it was hidden inside this very ordinariness. No one woke up thinking, today is the last day of the world. Perhaps this is the sharpest warning this story gives us. Disaster usually doesn't arrive with an alarm. It arrives quietly, slipping in among the routines of everyday life. Today's Nephilim. Maybe no giant walks through your life. But stop for a moment and think, what are the forces that crush you, that make you feel small, that take control away from you? Maybe an addiction, growing slowly. Maybe a toxic relationship, shrinking you a little more every day. Maybe an unchecked ambition, or a screen, an algorithm, that has taken hold of you. Those heroes in Noah's day, the Gibborim, crushed the world with their strength, made names for themselves, gathered admiration. Today, too, there are giants crushing us from within our own lives, just in a different form, less visible, but just as destructive. What Noah's story teaches us is this: even while the majority is heading in the wrong direction, a single person can remain right. Even if everything around you looks corrupted, you can be that Noah quietly, patiently, the one who keeps doing what's right, even if no one listens for 120 years. And perhaps the most important question is this: if a flood were coming today, would you be in the ark, or would you be left outside? Noah's contemporaries probably felt safe too. They had power, heroes, men of renown, everything seemed under control, until the sky broke open. The same illusion can easily take hold of us today. But this part of the Bible reminds us that external power can never replace inner integrity. This story teaches us three things. First, crossing boundaries always carries a cost. Second, God's patience is long, but it is not infinite. Even 120 years comes to an end. Third, even in the middle of darkness, there is always a Noah, someone who resists, who stays true, who carries hope, and perhaps that person is you. If this video made you think, write no in the comments. That way I can see who this story touched. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and send it to someone who needs to hear this story. Because the waters always rise. The question is, are you ready? On this channel, every week, we step into the hardest, least discussed passages of the Bible because we believe the truth, however uncomfortable, is always worth searching for. If this video made you think this way, let me know in the comments which dark corner you want us to shine a light on together next time. See you in the next video.
Every story has an ending, but this is just the beginning.